I never believed the Ouija board was anything more than a gimmick, a glorified piece of cardboard with letters printed on it. My skepticism made me the perfect candidate to debunk it when my younger sister, Mia, begged me to join her and her friends one evening. They had been daring each other to play, claiming they'd heard strange stories about messages from beyond. I laughed it off and agreed, thinking it would be an easy way to prove the whole thing was just make-believe. The setting was cliché, a dimly lit basement in our parents' house, with candles flickering in a semicircle around the board. Mia's friends, Jake and Lila, looked more nervous than excited as we sat cross-legged on the old carpet. I couldn't resist teasing them, saying we should probably prepare for nothing more than awkward silence and giggles. As we started, Mia explained the rules. Don't take your hands off the planchette, don't ask stupid questions, and always say goodbye. I rolled my eyes but played along. My fingers rested lightly on the plastic pointer, joined by the others. Mia asked the first question, "Is anyone there?" To my surprise, the planchette moved. It slid to yes with what felt like deliberate precision. I glanced at Mia, sure she was pushing it, but her wide-eyed expression seemed genuine. Lila's face turned pale, and Jake muttered something about how creepy it was. We continued asking questions, harmless ones at first, like the spirit's name and age. It claimed to be someone named Ruth, a woman in her 20s who had lived in the 1920s. Every answer felt carefully crafted, as if one of us had been rehearsing a story to spook the others. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The planchette's movements were too smooth, too coordinated for three teenagers who could barely sit still. Then Jake asked a question that changed everything. He leaned forward and, in a half-joking tone, said, "How did you die?" The response was immediate and chilling. "Fire." Lila gasped, pulling her hands back from the board. Mia scolded her for breaking the rule, but I could see she was shaken too. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a coincidence. I stayed quiet, my mind racing through possibilities. Was it really random, or had someone in the group been steering the answers? I decided to test it. Without telling the others, I asked a question only I would know the answer to. "What's the name of my childhood dog?" The planchette moved again, spelling out Max. My breath caught. That was correct. I hadn't mentioned Max in years, not even to Mia. My logical brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe I'd said the name in passing and forgotten. Maybe someone had looked it up. But the unease had settled in my chest, and I couldn't shake it. We wrapped up the session with a hasty goodbye, and everyone agreed to call it a night. I helped Mia clean up, still replaying the evening in my mind. She asked if I thought it was real, and I shrugged, telling her it was probably just one of us messing around. But I couldn't convince myself of that. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable events. Doors creaking open, lights flickering. I chalked it up to the house's age and faulty wiring. Then it escalated. I started finding objects moved from their usual spots. My phone, always on the nightstand, would turn up in the living room. A set of keys I'd left on the kitchen counter appeared in my bedroom. Felt like someone was playing tricks, but no one in my family admitted to it. One evening, I came home to find the Ouija board on my bed. I'd watched Mia pack it away in the basement, so how had it ended up there? I confronted her, but she swore she hadn't touched it. I believed her. She looked genuinely confused and a little scared. I decided to get rid of it, stuffing it in a trash bag and leaving it by the curb. The next morning, the board was back in the basement. I'd have thought Mia was lying, except she wasn't home that night. My parents dismissed it as a prank, but their dismissiveness only added to my frustration. I decided to destroy the board myself. I broke it into pieces and burned it in the backyard fire pit, watching the flames consume the cardboard. That should have been the end of it, but the disturbances only grew worse. I started hearing faint whispers at night, just on the edge of perception. They weren't words so much as a low, indecipherable murmur. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced someone had been standing in the corner of my room. My family began to notice too. Mia complained about nightmares, and my mom mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I reached out to Jake and Lila. Jake admitted he'd felt uneasy ever since the session, and Lila revealed she'd been having vivid dreams about a house fire. None of us had an explanation, but we all agreed that something about that night had set off a chain of events we couldn't control. I decided to dig deeper into the history of our town, searching for any record of a woman named Ruth who might have died in a fire. My research turned up nothing, no local tragedies, no unsolved mysteries. It was as if the name and story had been plucked from thin air. Desperate for answers, I revisited the night in my mind, analyzing every detail. It struck me that we had all gone into the session with different expectations. Mia and her friends wanted to be scared, while I wanted to prove them wrong. Could our collective mindset have influenced the outcome? Maybe the board wasn't haunted, but our own fears and imaginations had created a self-fulfilling prophecy. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances gradually faded. The whispers stopped, the objects stayed in place, and the house felt normal again. But the experience left a mark on all of us. Mia refused to talk about it, and her friends drifted apart, as if the memory was too heavy to carry together. I've avoided anything to do with Ouija boards ever since, not because I believe in ghosts, but because I've seen how easily the human mind can spiral into darkness when given the right nudge. Even now, I'm not sure what to believe. Was it all a coincidence? A series of random events we connected in our heads? Or was there something deeper at play? Not supernatural, but psychological? Either way, I've learned to be careful about what doors I open, even if they're only in my mind. It all began with a dare. My college friends, bored on a rainy Friday night, decided it would be hilarious to bring out an old Ouija board they found in the attic of the house we rented. I was against it from the start, not because I believed in spirits or supernatural nonsense, but because it felt like one of those things people only did in horror movies before everything went horribly wrong. But peer pressure won out, as it usually does when you're 20 and too embarrassed to seem scared. The group consisted of me, my roommate Tyler, his girlfriend Natalie, and two of her friends, Megan and Chris. The Ouija board was in rough shape, its edges worn and stained with something I didn't want to think too hard about. Tyler cleared a spot in the living room and set it down, lighting a few candles to set the mood. I rolled my eyes but joined them around the board, figuring I'd get through it and move on to something less ridiculous. As we placed our fingers on the planchette, Natalie took the lead, asking, "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette didn't move. We sat in silence for a while, the rain pattering against the windows, before Megan whispered that we should try again. Tyler repeated the question, and this time the planchette shifted slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch everyone's attention. Chris joked that one of us must be pushing it, but no one admitted to it. We continued, asking basic questions. "What's your name? How old are you?" The answers came slowly, spelled out one letter at a time. The board claimed to be communicating with someone named Aaron, a man in his 40s who had lived in the house decades ago. Tyler seemed fascinated, pressing for details about Aaron's life. Megan, on the other hand, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then Natalie asked a question that shifted the mood entirely. "How did you die?" The planchette moved quicker this time, spelling out a single word, murder. A nervous laugh rippled through the group, but I couldn't help noticing the tension in everyone's posture. Megan suggested we stop, but Tyler dismissed her, saying it was just getting interesting. "Who killed you?" Tyler asked, his tone half-joking. The planchette paused, then spelled out, "Whoa." Silence fell over the room. Chris made a weak attempt at a joke, but no one laughed. Megan pulled her hands away, muttering that this was stupid. I agreed and suggested we put the board away, but Tyler insisted it was all part of the fun. Natalie asked one last question. "What do you want?" The answer was immediate. Justice. At that point, even Tyler seemed uneasy. We hastily said goodbye, following the so-called rules to close the session, and packed the board back into its battered box. The rest of the night was subdued, everyone retreating to their rooms early. I told myself it was just a game, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The next day, strange things started happening. Tyler complained that his phone alarm went off at 3:15 a.m., even though he hadn't set it. Megan found scratches on her arm she couldn't explain, and Natalie swore she heard someone whispering her name in the middle of the night. I dismissed it as paranoia, the kind of thing that happens when you let your imagination run wild after a spooky experience. But then it happened to me. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Thinking it was Tyler or one of the others, I got up to check, but the hallway was empty. As I stood there, I felt a cold draft, even though all the windows were shut. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Over the next week, the incidents escalated. Megan refused to come over anymore, saying she felt watched every time she was in the house. Tyler started having vivid nightmares about someone standing at the foot of his bed, and Natalie broke down crying one evening, saying she couldn't handle the constant feeling of dread. Even Chris, the biggest skeptic among us, admitted he'd seen shadows moving out of the corner of his eye. I decided to do some digging into the history of the house. What I found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Decades ago, a man named Aaron had indeed lived there. He was a recluse who rarely interacted with neighbors. One night, his house caught fire, and he died in the blaze. The cause of the fire was never determined, but there were rumors of foul play. Some suspected a local troublemaker who had been seen arguing with Aaron days before the fire. Others believed Aaron had set the fire himself. Armed with this information, I confronted Tyler and Natalie. They were reluctant to talk about the Ouija board, as if discussing it might make things worse. Megan and Chris wanted nothing to do with it. Eventually, we agreed to destroy the board, hoping it would put an end to whatever was happening. We burned it in the backyard, watching as the flames consumed the worn cardboard and plastic. For a while, things seemed to calm down. The strange occurrences stopped, and the house felt normal again. But the unease lingered. I couldn't help but wonder if we had let our imaginations get the better of us, or if we had inadvertently stirred up something we didn't understand. To this day, I'm not sure what to believe. The rational part of me insists it was all coincidence, a combination of group hysteria and a creepy backstory. But another part of me remembers the way the planchette moved, the way the air felt heavy and charged during the session, and wonders if we had been playing with forces we couldn't comprehend. Either way, I've made a promise to myself. Never again. I hadn't planned to be part of the group that night. My sister, Claire, had begged me to join her and her friends for what she called a fun little experiment. They were high school seniors with a penchant for the dramatic, and I was a college sophomore who had grown weary of their antics. Still, she was insistent, and I figured keeping an eye on her was worth a few hours of my time. The Ouija board was already set up in the basement when I arrived. The room was dimly lit, with an ancient floor lamp casting a pale yellow glow over the scene. Claire and her three friends, Lily, Jake, and Sarah, sat cross-legged around the board. They had candles, a notebook for jotting down responses, and an air of solemnity that bordered on absurd. Claire waved me over, motioning to the spot next to her. "We're just about to start," she said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I sat reluctantly, eyeing the board. It looked old, the letters faded and the edges frayed. Jake, the self-appointed leader of the group, explained the rules. We were to keep our fingers lightly on the planchette, ask questions one at a time, and never, under any circumstances, remove our fingers before saying goodbye. I rolled my eyes but nodded along. The first few questions were standard fare. "Is anyone here? What's your name? How old are you?" The planchette moved hesitantly, spelling out responses that felt generic. Claire jotted them down diligently, though I was convinced one of them was pushing it. Probably Jake, who had a flair for theatrics. Things took a turn when Sarah asked a question none of us had expected. "What do you want?" The response was immediate and unsettling. "WARN. Warn who?" Jake asked, leaning closer to the board. The planchette hesitated before spelling out CLAIRE. Claire laughed nervously, brushing it off as a coincidence. but I saw her hands tremble as she held the notebook. I suggested we stop, but Jake insisted we keep going, eager to get to the bottom of it. "Warn me about what?" Claire asked, her voice quieter now. The board's answer came slowly, one letter at a time. "Him. Who is him?" Lily pressed. No response. The planchette stopped moving, and the room grew uncomfortably quiet. Claire tried to laugh it off again, saying it was probably a joke. But I could tell she was shaken, and to be honest, so was I. The session ended shortly after that. We said goodbye, following the rules to the letter, and packed up the board. Claire's friends left soon after, chatting about how creepy it had been. Claire and I were left to clean up the basement. She seemed distracted, her usual chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension lingered. Claire mentioned feeling like she was being watched, though she laughed it off as paranoia. I tried to reassure her, even though I couldn't shake the unease I'd felt that night. Then, 3 days after the session, something happened that neither of us could ignore. Claire was walking home from school when a car ran a red light at the intersection near our house. She froze, caught in the middle of the street as the car barreled toward her. At the last second, a man pulled her out of the way. She described him as tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a gray hoodie. He didn't say a word, just nodded at her and walked away. When she tried to thank him, he was gone. She told me the story that evening, her voice shaky but steady. I could see the fear in her eyes, though she tried to downplay it. "It's probably just a coincidence," she said, more to herself than to me. But we both knew it was strange, too strange to ignore. Over the next week, Claire became increasingly paranoid. She stopped walking home alone, started double-checking the locks on the doors, and kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. I tried to reason with her, telling her that the Ouija board was just a game and that the car incident was a freak accident. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of Claire's voice. She was talking to someone, though her words were muffled. I got out of bed and went to her room, only to find her sitting on the floor with the Ouija board in front of her. The candles were lit, and the planchette was moving. "Claire, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "I need answers," she said simply. I pulled her away from the board and blew out the candles. She didn't resist, but she kept staring at the board as if it held some kind of power over her. I packed it up and hid it in the attic, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But things didn't improve. Claire's anxiety worsened, and she started having vivid nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, convinced that someone was in the room with her. I stayed by her side, trying to comfort her, but I felt helpless. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was all psychological, a result of stress and the power of suggestion. But another part of me wasn't so sure. Eventually, I convinced her to see a therapist. She started going weekly, and slowly things began to improve. The nightmares became less frequent, and she stopped looking over her shoulder all the time. The Ouija board remained in the attic, untouched and forgotten. Years later, Claire and I talked about that night. She admitted that she still thought about it sometimes, especially the warning. "Maybe it was just a coincidence," she said, "but it felt real in the moment." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I'd never told her about the notebook, the one where she'd written down the answers during the session. After she went to bed that night, I'd flipped through it and noticed something strange. Among the scattered letters and half-formed words, there was a single phrase written in shaky handwriting that didn't match hers. "Stay close. I've kept the notebook all these years, tucked away in a drawer." I tell myself it's just a reminder of how our minds can play tricks on us. But every now and then, I take it out and stare at those 2 words, and I wonder if it was something more.